The humid Charleston air hung heavy, thick with the scent of magnolia and a tension I couldn't quite name. It was just a look, a fleeting moment, as I passed Declan in the hallway of my Sullivan's Island beach house. But what was I thinking? The fitted sundress, the one with the low back. I knew better. His gaze followed me, slow and possessive, not just curious, but hungry. It felt like an unspoken challenge, a dare whispered on the salty breeze. For the first time since Robert's death, I didn't know whether to retreat or lean into the storm brewing between us. It was a Saturday, the kind of lazy, sun-drenched morning I used to cherish. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore and the distant cry of gulls. I'd been savoring the peace, the rare stillness. Declan, Robert's nephew, a promising architect fresh out of Clemson, had been staying with me for a few weeks, helping me get the old house ready for sale, a task I'd been putting off for months. His presence filled the void Robert had left, but in ways I hadn't anticipated. I thought it would be temporary, a brief stopover before he launched his career in Charlotte. But even in that short time, he changed the house, brought a quiet energy back into its empty rooms. And, I hated to admit it, he'd brought something else back into me. The dress. I hadn't given it a second thought. A seafoam green sundress Robert had bought me on a trip to Savannah. It wasn't overtly revealing, but it clung, hinting at the curves beneath. I hadn't expected to see Declan, assuming he'd still be asleep. But as I walked down the hallway, coffee mug in hand, there he was, leaning against the wall, barefoot, a half-smile playing on his lips. The smile froze as his gaze drifted over me, lingering, burning, before meeting mine. Welcome to the heartstrings and scars, where we unravel the untold stories of love, betrayal, and the life-changing lessons they leave behind. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. We promise you stories that will make you reflect, question, and maybe even see yourself in the characters we share. Morning, he'd said, his voice deceptively casual, but his eyes betrayed him. Good morning, I'd replied, clutching my mug like a shield, hurrying past him. I felt his gaze follow me, a physical heat that brought a flush to my cheeks. My heart was pounding, a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was nothing, I told myself, just a look. But that look, it lingered, a persistent echo throughout the day. Do you ever feel that way? Like one brief moment can shift the very ground beneath your feet. Declan had always been polite, reserved. He was nothing like Robert, who'd been boisterous and charming, the life of every party. Declan was quieter, more introspective, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. It had taken years for him to warm up to me after Robert and I married, but by the time he left for college, we'd settled into a comfortable, if distant, understanding. But the man who'd returned to my Sullivan's Island home after Robert's passing wasn't the boy who'd left. Declan had grown into himself. He was confident, self-assured. There was a quiet intensity about him that unsettled me in ways I couldn't explain. It wasn't just his looks, though I'd be lying if I said I hadn't noticed the breadth of his shoulders, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes, the color of the Carolina sky, crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was more than that. It was the way he filled the house with his quiet presence, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And now, with that lingering look replaying in my mind, something had undeniably shifted. I tried to shake it off, throwing myself into meaningless tasks. I cleaned the already spotless kitchen, organized the pantry, even spent an hour battling the relentless palmetto bugs in the garden. But no matter how hard I tried, Declan's image, his gaze, remained. That evening, we ate dinner together, a habit we'd fallen into. The conversation was light, easy, but I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on me when I spoke. "You've been busy today," he said, leaning back in his chair, a hint of amusement in his voice. I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on my plate of shrimp and grits, just trying to stay productive. His lips quirked into a small smile. "You always have to keep yourself busy, don't you, Clara?" The question caught me off guard. I looked up, meeting his gaze across the antique dining table. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," he said quickly, but his expression softened. "It's just, you deserve to take a break sometime." The sincerity in his voice, the way he said it, left me momentarily speechless. I forced a smile, changing the subject, but his words lingered long after dinner was over. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Declan had looked at me in the hallway, the intensity of his gaze, the way it had made me feel both vulnerable and alive. It was a feeling I hadn't expected, wasn't sure I wanted, but it was undeniable, and no amount of reasoning could make it disappear. Have you ever felt that pull, that undeniable attraction, even when you know it's wrong? The following days were a careful dance. I told myself to keep my distance, to maintain the boundaries that had always been there. But Declan's presence was magnetic, and no matter how hard I tried, I found myself drawn to him. It started subtly. He began joining me in the garden, offering to help with the weeding or trimming the overgrown hedges. At first, I thought it was just politeness, a way for him to pass the time. But then there were the moments, brief touches, lingering gazes, that felt like they meant something more. One afternoon, I was struggling with a particularly stubborn weed when Declan crouched beside me, his hand brushing against mine as he reached for the root. "Here," he said softly, "let me—" His strong hands worked the weed free from the soil. When he looked up at me, a faint smile playing on his lips, I felt a strange flutter in my chest. "You make it look easy," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "It's all about the angle," he replied, his smile widening. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the sunlight catching the golden highlights in his hair. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Thanks," I murmured, turning back to the garden, but I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my hand tremble. That evening, after dinner, we sat together in the living room. A summer storm had settled in, the rain a steady rhythm against the windows. Declan was stretched out on the couch, flipping idly through a magazine, while I sat in an armchair with a cup of chamomile tea. "I don't know how you stay so calm," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" He closed the magazine, his gaze meeting mine. "This house, it's so quiet. Doesn't it ever get overwhelming?" I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the mug. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I'm used to it." Declan nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I don't think I could do it. You need noise, movement, something to keep you busy." I smiled faintly. "That's why you're always fixing things, isn't it?" He chuckled. "Maybe." There was a pause, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. "I didn't mean to bring it up," he said finally, his tone softer. I don't know. I feel like you deserve more than this." The sincerity in his voice took me off guard. I stared at him, unsure how to respond. "More than what?" He gestured vaguely around the room. "This quiet, this loneliness. You deserve to feel alive." The word hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Declan," I said quickly, setting my mug down and standing. "You don't need to worry about me." But as I walked past him, I could feel his eyes on me, steady and unflinching. The following day, he would find me in the garage, that I may be hiding from last night's conversation, but also to look at Robert's tools. "Need something?" His voice made me jump slightly, the wrench almost slipping from my fingers. I turned, trying to compose myself. No, just looking. I hesitated, my gaze sweeping over the shelves crammed with tools, paint cans, and half-finished projects. Robert always said you never know when you might need something. Declan smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Sounds like him. A heavy silence settled between us, the weight of Robert's absence palpable. He turned to me, his Carolina blue eyes searching mine. Do you miss him? The question, so direct, so unexpected, brought a lump to my throat. Every day, I whispered. He nodded, his expression unreadable. Me too. He paused. He wouldn't want you to be alone. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I didn't know what to say. My emotions were a tangled mess I couldn't begin to unravel. That evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I felt Declan's presence before I heard him. He leaned against the doorframe, watching me. You don't have to do all that, he said softly. I didn't look at him. I don't mind. There was a pause, the kind that made the air between us feel thick and charged. Clara, he said, and the way he said my name made me stop. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What? He hesitated, his gaze locking with mine. You don't always have to do it alone. I didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me, it was too much. I turned back to the sink, my hands trembling as I picked up a plate. But his words stayed with me, long after he'd left the room. A seed had been planted, a dangerous, exhilarating seed of possibility. The days that followed were a blur of unspoken desires and carefully guarded boundaries. Declan was around the house more, working on small projects he'd taken upon himself, fixing a squeaky door, oiling the hinges of the old shutters. His presence, while a constant source of both comfort and turmoil, was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I found myself wandering into the living room. Declan was there, sprawled on the couch, a book resting on his chest. The soft glow of the lamp cast shadows across his face, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching him. Can't sleep, he asked, his voice low and quiet. I shook my head, stepping further into the room. Not really. He sat up, placing the book on the coffee table. Want to sit? I hesitated for only a second before sinking into the armchair across from him. The silence between us was heavy, the kind that felt like it was waiting for someone to break it. I was thinking about Robert today, I said, finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Declan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. What about him? Just how he used to fill this house. It feels so quiet without him. Declan's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. It doesn't feel quiet to me, he said softly. I looked at him, my breath catching in my throat. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at me, that made the air between us feel charged. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. He stood, crossing the room to kneel in front of my chair, and my heart leaped into my throat. His hand reached for mine, his touch warm and steady. Clara, he said, my name a quiet plea on his lips. Declan, I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me like he was trying to memorize my face, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. Tell me I'm not imagining this, he said, his voice raw. I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. I was feeling it, and neither was he. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice breaking. Neither do I, he said, but I can't stop thinking about you, about us. The word sent a shiver through me, and before I could stop myself, my free hand reached up to touch his face. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were filled with so much longing it made my chest ache. We can't, I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "Why not?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Because it was wrong, because it was complicated, because it could ruin everything." But none of those reasons felt strong enough to make me pull away. The very next day, I avoided him. "I am sure you understand. This turmoil, it's exhausting, isn't it?" I threw myself into cleaning, moving furniture, anything to occupy my hands and my mind. But his presence was everywhere, in the scent of his aftershave that lingered in the hallway, in the half-finished cup of coffee he'd left on the counter, in the echo of his laughter from the night before. By mid-afternoon, the tension was unbearable. I found myself in the library, rearranging books on the shelves in a desperate attempt to keep busy. "Do you need help with that?" Declan's voice came from the doorway, and I jumped, a book slipping from my hand. "No," I said quickly, bending to pick it up. "I've got it." He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. "Clara, we need to talk." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, turning back to the shelves. "Why not?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "Because—" I trailed off, my hands trembling as I placed the book on the shelf. "Because you're scared," he said, stepping closer. I turned to face him, my back against the bookshelf. "Of course I'm scared," I said, my voice rising. This isn't supposed to happen." "But it did," he said, his voice calm. "And pretending it didn't won't make it go away." I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He stepped closer, his hands bracing against the shelf on either side of me, trapping me in place. "Clara," he said softly, his voice a whisper against my skin. "Just tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll walk away." I couldn't say it because it wasn't true. Instead, I reached up, my hand trembling as it rested against his chest. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice breaking. "You don't have to do anything," he said softly, leaning in until our foreheads touched. "Just let me in." And I did. That evening, the storm returned, rain pounding against the windows as thunder rolled in the distance. We sat on the couch together, the silence between us heavy but no longer uncomfortable. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "No," I said honestly. He nodded, his expression softening. "Neither do I." The tension between us was still there, but it felt different now, less like a burden and more like a promise. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. And when he leaned in, pressing his lips to mine, I didn't stop him. The house was quiet that night, the storm outside, subsiding into a steady drizzle. I sat in the living room, a book in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in over an hour. My mind was elsewhere, on him, on the moments we'd shared, on the way his gaze made me feel like I was coming undone. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Declan walked into the room, his presence filling the space in a way that was impossible to ignore. He was barefoot, his shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a quiet intensity in his expression that made my heart race. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, setting the book aside. "No. You." He shrugged, leaning against the doorway. "Not really." "Can I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the spot beside me on the couch. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I turned to him, my breath catching in my throat. "About what?" "About us," he said, his gaze meeting mine. I looked away, my hands twisting in my lap. "I don't know if I can." "You can," he said gently, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, steady, grounding. "Just tell me how you feel." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "It's complicated," I said finally. "I don't care," he replied, his voice soft but resolute. I looked up at him, my eyes burning with unshed tears. "That's not that simple, Declan. It's wrong." Is it? He asked, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. Because other people might not understand. Because it scares you? Because it scares me too, Clara. But I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt my walls cracking, the carefully constructed facade I'd built over years of loneliness beginning to crumble. Declan, I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. Just tell me to stop, he murmured. If you don't feel the same, just say the word, and I'll leave you alone. But if you do, I couldn't say it. I couldn't tell him to stop because I didn't want him to. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a tentative kiss. It was soft, hesitant, but the second his hand came up to cup my cheek, it deepened. A lifetime of longing, of loneliness, of denying myself the chance to feel alive again. All of it poured into that kiss. His touch was gentle but insistent, igniting something in me I thought had died a long time ago. We didn't make it upstairs right away. The living room became a blur of soft whispers and quiet gasps, our movements slow and deliberate as we explored the boundaries we'd both been too afraid to cross. By the time we made it to my bedroom, the rain outside had picked up again, the sound of it tapping against the windows as lightning flashed in the distance. Declan paused at the doorway, his gaze searching mine. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I said, the word leaving my lips without hesitation. The next moments unfolded with a tenderness that took my breath away. Declan's touch was reverent, his movements deliberate, as if he were afraid I might vanish if he wasn't careful. I let myself surrender to him, to the way he made me feel seen and wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that felt impossibly deep, like we were both finding something we hadn't even realized we'd lost. When it was over, we lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the room bathed in the soft glow of the storm outside. Declan's arm was draped over my waist, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. Are you okay? He asked, his voice breaking the quiet. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Yes, I said softly. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, pulling me closer. I meant what I said, he murmured. I don't care how complicated it is. I just want to be with you. Tears stung my eyes, and I buried my face against his chest. I don't know what happens next, I admitted, my voice trembling. We'll figure it out, he said, his tone steady. One step at a time. I woke before the sun, the house still shrouded in the soft gray light of dawn. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the rhythmic sound of Declan's breathing beside me. His arm was draped over my waist, his warmth a steady presence against the cool morning air. The events of the night before felt like a dream, fragile and surreal, but the weight of his hand on my hip and the way his chest rose and fell told me it was real. A whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to joy, swirled within me. I slipped out of bed, carefully, not wanting to wake him, pulling on my robe. I padded to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The house felt different this morning, quieter, but in a way that wasn't unsettling, but peaceful. I brewed a pot of coffee, the scent filling the air as I leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The garden glistened with dew. The daisies Declan had teased me about still standing tall in the early light. Last night, I had let my guard down completely, and now I wasn't sure how to put it back up. Everything felt so precarious, like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't fully see. Morning. His voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled, and there was a softness in his eyes that made my chest constrict. "Good morning," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He walked over to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against the opposite side of the kitchen island. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we hadn't said. "Are you okay?" he asked finally, his tone careful. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was the truth. He smiled faintly, setting his mug down. "I am." The raw simplicity of his words made my throat tighten, and I looked down at the counter, my fingers tracing the edge of the mug in my hands. "I don't know what happens now," I admitted. "Neither do I," he said, his voice steady. "But I don't regret it, Clara. Not for a second." I looked up at him, his words sinking into my chest like a bomb. "I don't regret it either," I said softly. The relief in his expression was palpable, and he stepped around the island, closing the distance between us. His hand found mine, his fingers intertwining with mine as he squeezed it gently. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice calm and sure. I nodded, holding on to his hand like it was the only thing keeping me steady. Later that morning, I sat on the porch with my second cup of coffee, the sunlight warming my skin as I watched Declan in the garden. He was kneeling, pulling weeds, his movements deliberate as he worked to tame the wild overgrowth. The sight of him there, so natural and at peace, brought a small smile to my lips. The guilt wasn't gone. It lingered at the edges of my mind, a quiet reminder of the line we'd crossed. But alongside it was something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The path ahead of us was uncertain, filled with questions I didn't have the answers to, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid to face it. As I sat there, the sound of birdsong in the distance, the gentle hum of the world waking up, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to feel alive again. And perhaps that is the greatest moral lesson of all, to allow ourselves to feel, to live even when it's terrifying. What do you think? Thank you for your time, and please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support us and join our growing community. We promise you stories that will make you reflect, question, and maybe even see yourself in the characters we share. Thank you.